Well, Denji's struggles with love continue, or at least it looks like they're gonna be continuing. Chapter 208 of Chainsaw Man has been released, and it's got a grim ending. See, happiness is absolutely a fleeting concept in the Chainsaw Man universe, and it's all but certain when you get about 100 chapters into a part of Chainsaw Man, be it part 1 or part 2, if Denji starts having a really good time with a girl, that girl's gonna go bye-bye. It happened with Power, it happened with Reze, it happened with Makima, and now it might be happening with Asa and Yoru. Because while a lot happens in Chapter 208 of Chainsaw Man, the big thing I want to talk about today is how it ends, which is with a giant spear being thrusted through the brain of Asa and Yoru. And as Asa and Yoru had to summon the Tank Devil and the Gun Devil from different corners of the earth simply to regrow their arms as the tank and gun gauntlets, a critical brain injury that looks like a gigantic 7-foot spear being thrusted through the brain of Asa and Yoru is probably not something they can bounce back from super easily. See, because what many online are saying, oh, she's a devil, she has the ability to regenerate, she can bounce back from this. Unfortunately, in the case of Asa and Yoru, it's not that simple, and thus it seems as though there is a solid possibility that our second main character of part 2 and Denji's most viable love interest ever may be gone. But that is only one out of 3 possible outcomes that I can think of. And thus today I want to talk about all those outcomes and talk about this incredibly pivotal moment in Chainsaw Man so we can all understand as to whether or not we need to get our hopes up or completely throw them out the window as Tatsuki Fujimoto is about to do what Tatsuki Fujimoto does best and break Denji's heart. Because today we're talking Asa is dead. Before we get to burying anybody, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you guys are looking for one additional Nick video a week, you can go ahead and find my Naruto reaction series using the 4th wall link in my description below. We're on to the Chunin exams, and Orochimaru, well, they're being creepy. Well, that's it. We got to talk about our favorite recurring sponsor to the page, Factor. Factor wants to help you take the stress out of meal planning and set you up for success. No more grocery stores, prep work, cooking fatigue, or even dishes. Instead, they want to give you chef-crafted, dietitian-approved meals delivered directly to your door. And with over 35 choices to choose from every single week, that include options like keto, vegan, vegetarian, calorie smart. They want to make sure that you are never fatigued and always intrigued by what you're eating. But they got you covered on so much more than just lunch and or dinner, as they're now offering loads of new options like snacks, smoothies, small bites, and so much more to keep you going regardless of what your schedule looks like. And for somebody like me whose schedule looks like perpetual and never-ending chaos, Factor is truly the only reason that I get to stay in good as shape as I currently am. As Factor makes sure that not only am I eating, but also that I'm hitting my macros and my calorie goals, all without having to worry about what I'm prepping, cooking, or cleaning up after. But there's a big difference between showing and telling, so let's head down to the kitchen and show off what I got from Factor this week.
Today we're cooking up the loaded bacon and spinach shredded chicken. This is one of my favorite meals from Factor, and it's just as easy to make as the other ones. You just pop out this sauce packet here, punch some holes in the foil, throw it in the microwave for 2 big whole minutes, and wait. Add our sauce here, and get to eating. Oh, a combo of the bacon and spinach with the chicken as a medium. That is delicious.
So what are you waiting for? Head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code 50TWC to get 50% off your first order plus free shipping. That's code 50TWC at factor75.com for 50% off your first order plus free shipping. Health has never been so easy. So before we talk about how Asa and Yoru could possibly bounce back from a fatal wound to the skull, let's set a little context as to how they got in this position in the first place. Last chapter, chapter 207, ended with Yoru trying to use the tank gauntlet for the first time that we had seen, in combination with every single weapon she had ever stockpiled to absolutely empty the clip at the Falling Devil. And while Yoru was able to land a flurry of random attacks on the Falling Devil, blowing her away with everything from human spine swords to Tamagotchi swords to fish swords, chapter 208 opens with the Falling Devil rising from the pile of accumulated weapons that Yoru fired into her, not only completely unscathed, but also in complete and total control of all of these Denji's weapons. And as she rises from this pile of weapons, she lets Yoru know that war is a concept that humans learn to be afraid of, but falling is a concept that humans are born afraid of, and therefore Yoru as the war devil could never lay a finger on her. She then lets Yoru know that she'll inflict 2 minor wounds on her, as she begins to float in the air with Yoru's weapons and points towards her location, firing Yoru's weapons back at her. Now it's this point that Yoru turns to Denji and lets him know that she's already wounded in her leg, and therefore Denji has to scoop up Yoru and begin to run away. Now at this point, rather funnily, Denji tells Asa to make a motorcycle, as a callback to one of the first times that Yoru and Denji were on the run from a much more powerful devil. However, Yoru lets Denji know that she can't just make a motorcycle. She needs a motorcycle to turn into a Chainsaw Man motorcycle, and since there's no motorcycles around, she can't do what he's asking. And thus Denji has to keep hoofing it out as Yoru points behind him and continually uses Bang to fire her own weapons out of the sky. However, as she's being overwhelmed by the onslaught of weaponry, Denji realizes that this can't go on forever, and therefore he kicks down the door of somebody's apartment. And just in time, because as they collapse into this apartment, a flurry of weapons get lodged in the wall of the front of the apartment directly behind them. Now to this point, in a moment of absolute desperation, that Yoru says on bated breath, "I'll use my absolute weapon number 2. And thus she places her hand on Denji's forehead. However, before Yoru is able to turn Denji into a weapon, Asa recedes control of the body, grabbing her arm and pulling it away from Denji's head and telling Denji that Yoru is trying to turn him into a weapon. However, Denji, who's still kind of banged up from his conversation with the Fire Devil, who told him all about the twins that the Fire Devil had fallen in love with as they had saved the Fire Devil from death, and thus the Fire Devil had granted the 2 twins the ability to transform into whatever they believed their shape of justice was, which for the 2 of them was some iteration of Chainsaw Man, as they were massive Chainsaw Man fans. However, one of them died when Denji was battling against the Cockroach Devil because Denji elected to save a cat over him. Tie this into the continual moral dilemmas that Denji has found himself in over the last 100 or so chapters, and Denji's about as beaten down and as battered as he's ever been emotionally. Whether it's his confusing relationship with Yoru and Asa, the death of Naota, or the fact that the world seems to be split as to whether or not they want the Chainsaw Man to exist in the first place, Denji, in this moment of weakness in chapter 208, lets all of these grievances get on top of him, and thus he looks Asa in the face and he says, "Go ahead. Do it. Turn me into a weapon. If it'll lighten the sins on my shoulders, I'll do anything." Now, Asa rejects this notion as she screams in his face, "You can't." But Yoru once again takes over her body, replacing her hand on Denji's head. But just as it appears as though Yoru is about to turn Denji into her ultimate weapon number 2, Yoru is also unable to turn Denji into a weapon. Mostly on account of the fact, undoubtedly, that Asa and Yoru's feelings have been getting intermingled, and Yoru finds herself falling in love with Denji, and thus as turning Denji into an ultimate weapon of sorts would effectively kill him, Yoru is also unable to do it. However, immediately after this hesitation, a second deluge of weapons bursts through the front of the apartment, one of which going directly through Asa's skull. Now, everything that happens in this chapter is incredibly important context, because while many people online are saying that Asa and Yoru are simply going to be able to bounce back from this injury because they, after all, are devils, are not taking into account the fact that Asa and Yoru are technically the weakest version of a devil. See, Asa and Yoru, while they seem to have this ability to swap in and out of who's in control of the body, something that we've never really seen before, are still technically in a fiend relationship. The war devil came to Asa while injured and grafted itself to Asa's body. And while fiends are still crazy powerful, especially fiends created from the war devil, one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, that does mean that Asa and Yoru technically have the weakest regeneration out of any of the devil types. Those types being fiend, devil, and hybrid. And therefore Asa and Yoru are closer to power and beam than they are to Denji. And therefore, while she does absolutely have a regeneration factor that allows for her to recover from simple or minor wounds almost instantaneously, her regeneration factor is actually worse than even just a standard devil's. Now, that's not to say that she couldn't recover from this injury. If she were to consume a bunch of blood, she probably could, as the consumption of blood is how every single type of devil recovers from injury, be they fiend, devil, or hybrid. But we have already seen Asa and Yoru lose both of their arms and not regenerate either of them, even though they were given ample time to do so, which means either they can't or they didn't want to. So up first, let's talk about that can't possibility. See, many on the internet would argue that a fiend doesn't have the ability to regenerate something as large as an entirely lost limb. And while we've seen fiends like Power be able to regenerate entirely lost limbs, as Power lost both of her arms in the battle against the Darkness Devil, Power as a fiend the Blood Devil actually has an ultra boosted regeneration factor, and therefore the consumption of blood, as she is the Blood Devil, super boosts her more than it does basically any other fiend, devil, or hybrid, which is why her regeneration factor went far and beyond even the regeneration factor of a lot of devils, like the Angel Devil, as Angel's arms very notably did not regenerate after being severed by the Darkness Devil. But even those who would argue that a fiend doesn't have the ability to completely regrow a lost limb, they would argue that a fiend has the ability to reattach a lost limb. However, since Asa and Yoru lost the arms that were cut off them, that is to say they don't know where they are, that's why Asa and Yoru had to elect for turning the Tank and Gun Devils, effectively the War Devil's children, into the Tank and Gun Devil gauntlets, replacing their arms. But this would seem to imply that Asa and Yoru aren't able to recover from grievous injuries, like, oh, I don't know, a spear straight through their cranium. However, there is others on the internet who would say that Asa and Yoru do have the ability to recover from these kind of injuries. However, Asa's inability to give in to her devil side stops the two of them from consuming blood and therefore regenerating. That is to say that Asa and Yoru have the ability to recover from grievous injuries, but Asa's inability to consume blood stops them from doing so. And while that technically is a much better situation for Asa and Yoru to be in right now, as their brains are leaking on the floor, as an ability to recover from an injury like that, just not the willingness, can be changed, while an inability to recover from an injury like that cannot be. And thus, which one of these camps you fall into is actually pretty important, because there's a fair to decent possibility, as Chapter 209 could very easily open with just Denji slicing one of his wrists and pouring blood into Yoru's mouth, doing it against Asa's will, but still activating a regeneration factor that allows for Asa and Yoru to recover from an injury like this. However, this is Tatsuki Fujimoto we're talking about, the man who wrote Fire Punch. And thus the idea of this potentially story-changing death being written out just a chapter later feels unlikely. And thus when it comes down to it, I have three ideas as to what this spear through Yoru's brain could possibly mean, and the futures they could bring about for the Chainsaw Man universe. So I want to go through these three options from my least favorite to my most favorite. And in a rare bit of good news as it pertains to the Chainsaw Man universe, I also believe as we work from my least favorite to my most favorite, we work from my least likely outcome to my most likely outcome. So let's go ahead and get started with what I believe is the least likely outcome and my least favorite outcome, which is rather simply that Yoru just dies. I mean, yeah, we've seen fiends die from less, but usually when we see a fiend die, it's because they sustain some kind of head injury, whether it's Beam being decapitated, Power being, well, I guess you could call it decapitated, but that's only because her head was basically all that was left, or the majority of Quan Chi's girlfriends being decapitated by the Darkness Devil. It seems like the most effective way to kill a fiend is to inflict head trauma, and thus an 8-foot spear through the skull seems like a good enough way to kill a fiend in Asa and Yoru. But even though that does seem like a somewhat likely possibility, it's just weird writing. Just plucking one of the main characters out of the story like that just wouldn't sit right with the entire fan base. Oh, Nick, they did it to Naota. I mean, like, yeah, they did it to Naota, but there was a lot of build up to Naota's death. So I really don't think this possibility is even worth discussing. The second possibility is that Asa and Yoru do die here. However, their death is not the end of their role in the story. See, because while they are technically fighting against the Falling Devil, the major antagonist of this arc is none other than the Death Devil, the person that we all thought was Fami for a long time. And when it was revealed that Fami wasn't actually the Famine Devil and was actually the Death Devil, we got to see one of the probably many techniques that the Death Devil has access to, which is that the Death Devil is able to return anybody that she kills back to life as a servant under her control. And thus when one of the twin boys who was given power by the Fire Devil and the Famine Devil tried to battle against the combined forces of the Falling Devil and the Death Devil killed the both of them and then consumed them, regurgitated them, and brought them back to life as servants. And this is absolutely a possibility for Asa and Yoru, as this would not be the first time that this kind of thing happened to Denji. In fact, if Asa and Yoru were killed by the Falling Devil, consumed consumed by the Death Devil and then brought back to life to battle against Denji. This would exactly mirror the Reze arc, as Reze, who was identified as a legitimate love interest for Denji even though she was a USSR assassin trying to kill him, was killed and controlled by Makima, and then her abilities were used in the ultimate final battle against Denji. So if Tatsuki Fujimoto were to subject Denji to this kind of unique heartbreak twice, it wouldn't be the craziest idea of all time. However, I don't believe this possibility is all that likely. Not because I don't think Tatsuki Fujimoto would do it twice, I absolutely do think he would do that, but because a couple of chapters ago, the Falling Devil pointed out something very important. See, when the Falling Devil was watching the Death Devil consume the Famine Devil and one of the twins, she offered up some exposition to us, the readers. And in that exposition, where she was explaining how the Death Devil abilities work, she included a very important tidbit of information, and that tidbit of information was that in order to bring somebody back to life as a Death Devil servant, the Death Devil had to be the one to kill them. Her exact line being, "Your power enslaves things that you've killed, but is it truly necessary for you to eat them alive?" Now, by eat them alive, the Falling Devil is referring to the flock of ravens that the Death Devil is able to use to consume people whole. And while I guess there is a possibility that through all the holes created by the weapons that the Falling Devil launched through the wall of this apartment, in chapter 209, we could see a flurry of ravens enter through and begin consuming Asa and Yoru's corpse, or like barely living body. To me, this feels unlikely, because while a lot of people do believe that Tatsuki Fujimoto is a highly chaotic manga artist, the reason that he included that tidbit of information about the Death Devil needing to kill those that she enslaves is because the Falling Devil is technically the person killing Asa and Yoru in this equation. And therefore, because the Falling Devil is the person who killed Asa and Yoru, it's unlikely that the Death Devil would be able to consume Asa and Yoru's corpse and then enslave her later on like she did for the Famine Devil. And while it would make sense that the Death Devil was trying to collect as many of the four horsemen of the apocalypse as slaves as possible, as they are her sisters and really the only non-primal devils who stand a chance in combat against her, I do believe Asa and Yoru taking a spear from the Falling Devil and not the Death Devil was done intentionally. And thus what would 100% be within the scope of things that Tatsuki Fujimoto would do to make Denji have to kill 2 of his girlfriends, 3 if you count Makima, and 4 if you count Aki. I don't think that's what we're going to be seeing in these upcoming chapters. Which brings us to our third and final option, which I believe is the most likely and also my favorite, which is that this brain injury is going to force Denji to choose either Asa or Yoru to save. But how and why? Well, it's important to note here that Asa and Yoru share a brain. This has been established multiple times. It's why they're able to swap between who's in charge of the body. Their connection as a fiend-human relationship is actually very rare and unique, as usually a fiend is created when a devil takes over a corpse, and therefore a fiend exists almost entirely as the devil that it originally was, as opposed to a somewhat combined dual personality. But why do I believe that Denji is going to have to choose between Asa and Yoru? And what about the situation lends itself to Denji being placed in the position to choose? Well, in the somewhat beginning of this chapter, the Falling Devil says something rather interesting, which is that she's going to inflict 2 minor wounds on Asa and Yoru. And while one could say that the spear to the brain was one of those minor wounds, and that the other minor wound is the leg wound that Asa told Denji about that required for her to be carried, I don't think that's what's going on here. See, I don't think the Falling Devil took into consideration the leg wound that Asa already had when talking about the 2 minor wounds it was going to inflict on Asa and Yoru. But if that's not the case, where's the second wound, you ask? Well, good question. See, I don't believe that the spear to the brain is actually just one injury. Like we've already talked about in this video, Asa and Yoru share a brain. So while a spear to the brain might just look like one injury, when there's 2 people in that brain, it's actually closer to 2, as 2 separate individuals are having their brains injured. Tie this into the fact that just a couple of chapters ago, the Fire Devil told Denji that he was once again going to have to make a tough decision, a decision akin to the decision that Denji made to save the cat over one of the twin brothers, and it seems as though the Fire Devil was telling Denji that sometime in the very, very near future, he was going to have to make a decision between 2 people as to which one he wanted to save. Now, some people dismissed what the Fire Devil said almost immediately, because immediately after the Fire Devil said Denji is going to have to make a difficult choice, Yoru was blasted through a building by the Falling Devil and screamed at Denji to help her. And as in the chapters previous to this, Yoru had absolutely displayed her devil-like mentality as she blew off the arm of a woman that Denji was trying to save from a falling building, laughing as she fell to her death because the way that she screamed was funny to Yoru. And in this moment, Denji remembered that Yoru, regardless of how nice she is to him, was a devil who wanted people dead, the exact opposite thing of what Denji wants, which is to save people and be beloved. And thus a lot of people believe that the difficult decision that Denji had to make was helping Yoru, somebody he already identified as a devil that probably doesn't deserve help or maybe even to be alive. But I don't think that's it. I believe the Fire Devil was talking about a potential choice between two different people. But how would the Fire Devil know that Denji would be placed in the situation where he would have to either choose Asa or Yoru? Well, there's really no way to know for certain. However, it is important to note that immediately prior to this moment, Denji had just cut down the last of the two twin brothers that had saved the Fire Devil. And that twin brother who Denji had just killed, the fake Sawman or the Justice Devil, or what we later learned to be somebody who had been granted abilities by the Fire Devil, had just been consumed by the Death Devil. And as any and everything that the Falling Devil does is under the directive of the Death Devil, it's a possibility that the Fire Devil's connection to this twin brother allowed for the Fire Devil to understand exactly what the Death Devil was trying to do. And thus the Fire Devil understood that the directive that the Falling Devil had, which was possibly to force Denji into a situation where he had to choose either Yoru or Asa to live. Now, as to why the Death Devil would want that, I can't say I know. I mean, we're talking about the endgame antagonist here who's been living amongst humans for the entirety of part 2 and has been proactively prepping not only Chainsaw Man, but also the War Devil to be as powerful as possible to counteract the coming of the Death Devil. But there's actually more evidence to substantiate the idea that Denji's gonna have to choose between Asa and Yoru. See, because in the very beginning of part 1, chapter 103, Denji goes to a cafe with Hirofumi, Octopus Guy, the guy who cuts off one of Asa's arms. And while on this cafe date with Hirofumi, Denji orders an entire cake. And even though Hirofumi offers Denji utensils to eat this cake with, Denji, rather purposely and slightly confoundingly, takes his hand, forms a karate chop motion, and cuts the cake directly in half. He then begins to eat the cake with his hands. Now in the moment, this just looks like Denji being Denji. He's a feral human. Why would he use utensils? However, in the very next chapter, chapter 104, in the first panel, Asa and Yoru are seen in their room absolutely seething about the fact that Chainsaw Man had saved them. And what are they wearing other than a gigantic cake-printed sweater? And thus a seemingly clear connection is made between Denji eating cake with his hands and splitting it in half, and Asa and Yoru who are wearing a cake sweater. And as the spear thrown by the Falling Devil seemed to go directly in the middle of Asa's skull, this splitting of the cake analogy could have been foreshadowing over 100 chapters ago the event of this chapter. And thus in chapter 209, we could see Denji presented with the quandary of either saving Asa or Yoru, a decision that would objectively be very tough for anybody. See, because Asa loves Denji, not Chainsaw Man, Denji. And Asa loves Denji so much that she actually wants to separate Pochita from Denji so he can live as a regular human. However, Yoru seemingly wants to turn Denji into a weapon, an incredibly powerful weapon that she can use to kill the Death Devil. And while that might make it seem to you that it's a clear choice between Asa and Yoru, I mean, one person loves him, one doesn't, it's not that black and white. See, it's established in this very chapter that Yoru very clearly has feelings for Denji, feelings so severe that she doesn't want to turn Denji into a weapon. And therefore it appears as though Yoru and Asa's feelings have truly, finally, completely intermingled. I mean, after all, Yoru is the person who's made all of the sexual advances on Denji. But Denji has also spent the last couple of chapters realizing that Yoru is a devil who has no sympathy for humankind. But Asa does. However, Asa has stated multiple times that she's okay with dying, and Yoru was actively trying to fight against the Death Devil to survive. Ties into the fact that if Yoru dies, Asa will most likely be no help in the battle against the Falling Devil and the Death Devil, whom Denji, Asa, and Yoru are currently fighting. And thus, fundamentally, there's no right choice. Asa's the better person, but if he chooses the better person, she'll probably die in this battle against the Falling Devil and the Death Devil. Yoru will help in the battle against the Falling Devil and the Death Devil, but as long as she's alive, humans will die to her cruelty. And thus Denji is faced with an impossible choice because the only way Asa and Yoru work is with each other. They balance each other out. But in the face of this impossible choice, who do I think Denji will choose? Yoru. Do I think Asa is probably the right choice? Yes. But considering the fact that Denji did fly into combat to help Yoru in the battle against the Falling Devil, and Yoru has been responsible for all of the sexual advances on Denji, makes me believe that in this impossible choice, Denji will choose Yoru. However, I can tell you right now, if he does choose Asa, part 2 of Chainsaw Man will be its final part, as choosing Asa will be representative of Denji making the right choice, overriding the sexual drive of his id to choose a person who truly, for the first time in his entire life, cares about him. But I'm fully willing to admit that even I don't have a strong feeling about which way Fujimoto is gonna go here. So I'm curious to hear from you guys. If it comes down to Denji having to choose between Asa and Yoru, who do you believe he's going to choose? Tell me in the comments below, and while you're down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go hope that I'm wrong about this entirely.